Before hopping into my next cinematic rambling, I just want to express my deepest sympathy. I can only imagine how the Black community is feeling right now. I don't feel like I can offer really any solutions to this kind of pain and hurt, but I'm reminded of a quote from the late, great Roger Ebert. The movies are like a machine that generates empathy. If it's a great movie, it lets you understand a little bit more about what it's like to be a different gender, a different race, a different age, a different economic class, a different nationality, a different profession, different hopes, aspirations, dreams, and fears. The stories we tell and the perspectives we share can really change us and inspire us to do good. And that is definitely the case with a few of the films I watched this week. I did not pick these films intentionally to follow any pattern, but pretty much all of the films that I watched and reviewed this week had to do with the responsibility of the individual human being to standing up to societal evils and the impact that even a single person can make in a positive or negative way against an entire nation or a community or the entire world. So let's jump back into the rabbit hole, shall we?
1 degrees, I'm coming back on down the coming back rabbit hole.
So we started off with Diner, bounced around a little bit, and last time we left off with a patch of blue. Moving forward, I'm going to fill in some Sidney Poitier gaps. Or one gap, I guess. And we'll do that with Blackboard Jungle.
Now, all your lives you're going to hear stories. What some guy tells you, what you see in books and magazines, on the television, the radio, what you read in the newspapers. But if you can just examine the story, look for the real meaning.
Richard Dadier, played by Glenn Ford, is a new English teacher at an interracial school full of delinquents, meaning that most of the students are violent, rude, disruptive, and just not a fun bunch. Sidney Poitier plays Greg Miller, who's sort of a ringleader of the class. Dadier is a stubborn, determined teacher who hopes to find any way to penetrate the hearts and minds of his students. This turns out to be not a very easy task, but eventually he makes some progress. I noticed some parallels with The Young Savages, in that we get this older, straight-laced white fellow who's hoping to make a difference, but ends up in some violent squabbles himself along the way. And I suppose the comparison makes sense because apparently they're both based on novels by author Ed McBain. It's clearly another social commentary film, and it doesn't achieve too much subtlety on these merits. But again, reminding myself this was 1955, so subtlety wasn't considered by all to be the best approach when making art for a mass audience about a social issue. Greg Miller is a fine character, and we have some good interplay and development between him and Dadier, who discovers Greg to be a talented young fellow who isn't as mischievous as he first leads on.
Same reason I live in this neighborhood. Colored neighborhood, Mr. Dadier. And folks don't care who fix up that car, black or white. Just so long as it's fixed good.
There's a few bits of historical significance behind this film. It's one of the first examples of using rock music for the soundtrack, and having a black man as a prominent role, even if it isn't the actual lead. It's one of Poitier's earliest films, and many consider it his breakthrough role. Aside from these iconoclastic gestures, it's a bit formulaic overall. And is this responsible for creating the white savior teacher stereotype? I don't know. Perhaps. All I know is it reminds me of at least half a dozen films that have come out over the last 20 odd years that feel like they're essentially trying to do the same thing. Although, to be fair, Poitier himself would also be performing another twist on the hero-teacher genre a decade later in To Sir with Love. Yet for an era like the 1950s, I think this story works. It tackles a pretty brave and relevant subject matter for its day, and though it's kickstarting a trope that many of us are probably tired of now and falls short of being anything remarkable, it at least deserves some mad points for its bravery and the social barriers it pushed against. So, I'll give it a B+ for effort. I'm going to take Anne Francis's lead on to Bad Day at Black Rock.
What's wrong with this town of yours, Miss Worth?
Nothing's wrong with this town, Mr. McCready. None of your concern.
Why is everybody so concerned about me, then?
Well, turns out Anne Francis is, I think, the only female character in this film. But hey, what can you do? This might be the earliest film I've seen that I would qualify as a modern Western, meaning the setting of the film took place within 10 years of its release. Though I guess some may call it a Western noir. Oh, I take that back. The Great Train Robbery, one of the first films ever, actually was modern when it was made. But anyways, this takes place right at the end of World War II, and the atmosphere this film sets its feet in just feels like it's reeling and recovering from a time of carnage and conflict. Spencer Tracy plays John J. McCready, a one-armed man whom we find out is a war veteran who waltzes into town looking for a Japanese-American farmer who went missing named Kamoko. A lot of the details of his background and whatnot are kind of murky, but it gives the film sort of an extra air of mystery to it. The townspeople are not helpful, to say the least. In fact, some may even call them a bit hostile. Macready plays himself cool as long as he can, but eventually tensions rise beyond a measure that peace can handle. The first half or so of the film is ripe with Old West stereotypes, like an unwelcome outsider wanders in and stirs the tensions, and everybody's kind of getting their panties in a bunch. But these tropes are turned a bit on their head. Instead of a young, cocky gunslinger, we have a mild-mannered old veteran with a handicap. This is a bit of a slow burn, but it trusts the audience to be patient while the story unravels its important themes. Much like a few of the films I've seen on this journey so far, racial tensions are glaringly present, but what's interesting is that we never see any members of the race being discriminated against. It's a solid old film where most of the action is actually off-screen, and it relies on character tension to drive the plot. This is the kind of movie I feel like future slow burn action films like First Blood and Walking Tall borrowed a lot from. But its genre fusion, thematic significance, and a handful of strong action scenes make it easy to recognize why it's often considered a timeless classic. Spencer Tracy has such a natural on-screen presence, and I feel a bit inexperienced with his work, so I'm going to have him lead me on to a film that's been on my list for well over a decade, Judgment at Nuremberg.
Their minds weren't warped at an early age by Nazi teachings. They embraced the ideologies of the Third Reich as educated adults, when they, most of all, should have valued justice.
This is a fictionalized version of one of the Nuremberg trials of 1947, which sought to bring international justice to military and, in this case, judicial leaders responsible for the many atrocities perpetuated by the Nazis. Most court dramas build up to the courtroom, but this one jumps right in within the first 10 minutes. And buckle up, because we stay in here for a huge chunk of the near 3-hour runtime. The point of view of this film I found a bit unique in that it follows the story of the judge himself, showing him working through the case between scenes, trying to be cordial and conversational with others outside of the court, and hoping to be treated like a normal human being instead of a judge. Early on, there's a notable scene with the house help that sets the tone for this struggle. He asks them what it was like to live in these conditions during and before the war. The couple immediately get a bit defensive and insist that they were unaware of the atrocities and they tried to remain apolitical and just do their job. As we can imagine, their story is probably pretty common to a lot of folks during that time. Admittedly, I've seen so many World War II and Holocaust films at this point, I almost feel desensitized to the subject matter, unfortunately. But, much like any great film, I was eventually sucked into that time and place. And as the events progressed, I found myself feeling and thinking deeper than I have in a long time about the utter barbarism that took place during this time. There's one particularly disturbing sequence where a video was shown and the horrific acts in question were described in gruesome detail.
Is this a lampshade made from human skin? Skin being used for paintings.
As far as noteworthy performances here, Marlene Dietrich is wonderful. Now that I think of it, I believe this is actually the first time I've seen her act in really anything. Maximilian Schell also delivers a convincing, remarkable performance as the German defense. His passion is very palpable, and sometimes it gets a little humorous when it reaches its peak. There's one moment here I couldn't help but laugh at.
Did you sit on his lap?
Yes, but...
You sat on his lap! What else did you do?
And, hey, look, it's Judy Garland. She cries a lot in this movie.
I hope you'll be comfortable here, sir.
And yes, that is William Shatner. However, the real meat of this film comes from an utterly poignant testimony by another familiar face in this project, Burt Lancaster, although in his makeup I barely recognized him, detailing how and why a country would become so desperate that they would allow themselves to embrace a monster like Hitler, though admittedly by doing so sacrifice all conscience they once held fast to.
My counsel says we were not aware of the extermination of the millions. He would give you the excuse. We were only aware of the extermination of the hundreds. Does that make us any the less guilty? Maybe we didn't know the details. But if we didn't know, it was because we didn't want to know.
This speech lasts for a solid 7 or so minutes, and it gives me chills just thinking about how powerful and brilliantly acted it is. I might call it one of the greatest cinematic monologues I've seen since Charlie Chaplin's iconic speech at the end of The Great Dictator. On a personal note, I actually started crying just as I was editing this piece together. It's something that has definitely never happened to me before, but that's really how powerful this sequence is. This is a film which more eloquently than any other I've seen cuts to the core of how and why humans can be swayed into evildoing, and yet how important it is that human beings take responsibility for their wrongdoings, whether they be acts of ambivalence or outright evil. In the end, watching Judgment at Nuremberg struck me about as deeply as reading a Dostoevsky novel. It's a total masterpiece.
I have nothing to add to what I have said.
I already mentioned that I'm a bit of a novice with Marlene Dietrich, and with an icon such as her, how can I go any other way?
Men cluster to me like moths around the flame, and if their wings burn, I know I'm not to blame.
Now jumping back a few decades prior to The Blue Angel, which is a historical milestone for several reasons. It's the first feature-length talkie from Germany, and the first time director Josef von Sternberg, as well as Dietrich, and lead actor Emil Jannings had worked in a sound production. A lot of breakthroughs happen here, but we'll get to that in a bit. The film is about Emanuel Roth, a local high school teacher who feels disrespected by his students, whom he thinks are being corrupted by a local cabaret woman named Lola, played by Dietrich. One night he takes a trip to the Blue Angel, where she performs, in hopes of catching the boys there. He does find the boys, but also a series of events gets him entangled with Lola, starting with a misunderstanding, but eventually surmounting to a love affair. Roth is a tight-ass, repressed character whom we see blossom out of his shell. What begins as mostly comedy takes some tragic turns and morphs into a tale of corruption and naivete. Dietrich is yet another one of those classic actors I've known by reference and reputation for many years, but seeing her do her thing here for the first time was exhilarating. This role really shows how incredibly charming and funny she was, and it's already obvious to me why she began to rise to stardom based largely on this one performance.
Ask you to be my wife.
Wife?
Yeah.
She's witty, sarcastic, flirtatious, and animated in a way I've not seen from any other actresses of this era. Though the film is really about Jannings' character, who does a wonderful job as well, the reputation this film has and deserves is about Marlene, and in fact her performance ended up landing her a contract with Paramount Pictures and subsequently a Hollywood career. She and Josef von Sternberg would go on to do lots more films together in Hollywood, but that relationship all started right here with The Blue Angel. It was actually filmed in two versions, one with the actors speaking German and the other where they spoke English. I don't know if that's just a German thing. I know Werner Herzog did the same thing with his Nosferatu adaptation in the 1970s. But after watching the whole thing in German and parts of it again in English, I think I prefer it in the native language since it feels a bit more natural that way. But whichever version you trace down, I'm sure you'll get a kick out of it. Emil Jannings is an actor I've never heard of, but he was a pretty prominent actor apparently during this era, so I'm going to move on to another collaboration he had with Josef von Sternberg, The Last Command. Knowing nothing going into this, just seeing Emil Jannings in a Russian uniform on the poster, I assumed I would be watching a war film. And kind of, but this turned out to be so much more than that. The film begins in its modern day in Hollywood. This Russian man, Sergius Alexander, is working as an extra on a film set, and while he's cast in a scene reenacting a Russian battle, he's triggered by a wartime memory, and most of the rest of the film is a flashback of his life as a Grand Duke in Tsarist Russia. As a Russian official during the revolution, it's apparent that Alexander tries to be a man of principle, but in a time where victory commonly went the way of less than admirable people, he gets pulled into a scenario that, let's just say without spoiling anything, it's an epic tragedy of love, betrayal, and violence that feels almost Shakespearean. Eventually, we end up back in Hollywood, highlighting Sergius Alexander's fall from greatness to utter poverty, and thus seeking out this background acting work to survive. On this film set, where Sergius is directed to reenact a battle charge, we end on a rather poetic and remarkable moment tying up the whole story. I think anybody will tell you that Emil Jannings' incredible performance carries this entire film's weight. He won the very first Best Actor Oscar at the first ever Academy Awards, for actually two performances, one for this film and the other for The Way of All Flesh. This was actually the first and last year where actors could be nominated for multiple performances. Since it's a silent film, these performances are clearly all about the physicality, and Jannings shows incredible range in his character arc, both emotionally and physically, as he has to play a man who has gone through some severe traumas. There is just so much power and dynamic in Jannings' character, and this might be the first time on film I've seen a Russian official of this kind humanized to this degree. The final scene of this film in the hands of any novice filmmaker would edge on melodrama, but the powerful collaboration between Jannings and von Sternberg actually make it a heartbreaking and believable conclusion. And I have to say, this may be the best performance by a lead actor in a silent film next to Maria Falconetti in The Passion of Joan of Arc. I really think it's that powerful and unique. William Powell, who played the Hollywood director, shall be directing my path towards something a little bit lighter. A classic screwball comedy from 1936, My Man Godfrey.
Godfrey Park, you old mug.
Oh, do you know Godfrey?
Know him? We went to Harvard together. I'm afraid you've confused me with someone else, sir. I'm Smith. Remember? Sure you're Smith.
Here, Powell plays Godfrey Park, a man living in a dump in the midst of the Great Depression. One fateful evening, a group of socialites show up and offer him $5 to participate in a scavenger hunt. From the get-go, Godfrey seems rather intelligent and witty, and he asks for a job in return for the favor. The younger woman, Irene, whom he befriends, recruits him as their new butler. Almost immediately after he starts working, Godfrey realizes that this family is utterly crazy.
Oh, darling, look at Carlo.
So what is all this nonsense?
Through most of the film, Godfrey's true background is murky, and it's an interesting journey finding out more about him along the way, through a handful of funny incidents. Given his apparent brilliance and tact, Godfrey understands how to act and adapt dynamically to practically everybody around him, and he's able to keep his job against the odds. One impediment he must deal with is Irene's older sister Cornelia, who has an especially big grudge against Godfrey. I did actually leave out a little detail that at the beginning, she was the one who initially approached him at the dump. And feeling a bit offended at the notion, he reacted in anger, causing her to fall in ashes, thus costing her her pride, her spot in the game, and probably a hefty cleaning fee for that dress, I'd assume. This isn't quite Marx Brothers slapstick. It relies heavily on the wit and banter of its fast-talking and sarcastic characters, but a lot of the comedy emerges from the shifting power dynamics between Godfrey and the rest of the characters, which makes for an interesting spice when we start to realize that Irene is completely enamored with him, but he refuses to reciprocate her feelings in any obvious way. This is my kind of popcorn entertainment comedy. It's clever, well acted, and paced very well. I think that many comedies from this era feel a bit dated, but it's apparent that My Man Godfrey has stood the test of time of, more than 80 years quite well.
Oh, you love me.
I do not love you, and you're getting me all wet.
You do, or you wouldn't have lost your temper. What is the meaning of this, may I ask? Oh, Mother, Godfrey loves me. Put me in the shower. What are you talking about?
I'd like to thank you all again for tuning in. Please stay safe and do what you can to be a positive change in the world during this time. Also, I'd greatly appreciate it if you like, subscribe, and stay tuned for the next video in this series.